Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Reeser. How can myth and folklore help us find our way in the second half of life? What can we learn from the places we inhabit and the stories that are rooted in the land? Today's guest is author and mythologist Sharon Blackie.
I believe that the second half of our lives is the time when we come into our calling. If I can't find in contemporary world or in contemporary women really good role models for menopause and beyond, how about if I go back to myth and especially to folklore? Because you always find that our ancestors had a perspective on these issues that is useful to us. Women are portrayed in our mythology as immanent in the land. They represent the moral authority of the other world that's entangled with the land.
Sharon Blackie's work is focused on the mythic imagination and how it's relevant to the personal, cultural, and environmental issues that we face today. She's a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, and in two of her recent books, Hagitude and Wise Women, she explores how folklore and myth help women to reimagine the second half of life. We talked over Zoom in fall of last year, each from our own wild corner of the world. Where are you speaking from now? I wanted to ask you, where is it that you're at?
The far north of England in the Pennines, kind of where I was born and where I thought I'd never come back to. So it's very beautiful here. It's very hilly and very, very wild. Nobody ever thinks that anywhere in England is wild, but this is. So.
All right, that's lovely. I'm also in the mountains of Sweden. You can't see it from here, but there's a beautiful lake just beyond the windows. So it's a very nice location to be speaking
my wild
from.
Place to your place, exactly.
Yes, exactly. We're each in our wild places. So I thought maybe for those who don't know you, you're a mythologist, psychologist, writer of both fiction and nonfiction. I was wondering, would you like to start by just saying a little bit about how you came to be doing what it is that you're doing, and especially how myth and story came to be such an entangled part of your life, how your life came to be entangled with that? Was it always like that from the very beginning, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was. I grew up in a household with no television for most of my childhood and teenage years, but my mother had a great love of books, a very poor household, but she loved books, and I was given many, many fairy tales and collections of mostly Greek and Roman, of course, mythology, but also some of the Irish and Scottish mythology that was from my heritage. So I loved it as a child. It's not that it was escapism for me. I had a complicated childhood. It's not so much it was escapism, but most of those stories, and particularly fairy tales, perhaps more than myth, helped me see how it might be possible to move from the impossible situations that every heroine faces at the beginning to some kind of more positive outcome. So as a child, myth and story was everything to me. Then I trained as a neuroscientist and actually then as a psychologist. And so my first background is psychology. So when I was working as a psychologist at various points in my life, I found that story was the most transformative therapy of all. Everybody loves a story, even when they try to tell you they don't. And stories, particularly myths and folklore, at the heart of them is transformation. And that is what you're trying to do as a psychologist. So I worked with them professionally. And then when eventually in my 40s, I became a writer, they just, myth and folklore just seeped into my fiction as well as my nonfiction. And I've always thought that they are at the heart of being human and teach us so much about how to navigate a very challenging world.
Yes, that really resonates with me because it seems to me like life is very much a story that we're all part of. I am so happy to be having this conversation with you because I'm trying to have a longer exploration on the podcast, specifically about women and how the physical changes that women go through throughout our lives, how they can be potentially very meaningful for us. So menopause, that you've written mostly recently about, just like menstruation and just like childbirth, it's often seen as this it's seen as this annoying, painful thing that women are quote unquote cursed with. And for many people, menopause is seen as this threshold after which, we're no longer interesting, we're no longer sexual, supposedly, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what I really appreciate about what you're doing in your work is trying to tease out a very different story about the second half of life, as you call it, about menopause and the time after it. So could you maybe say something about your own experience of menopause, and maybe about how you came to write your two most recent books? I know you're writing it, you've now completed another one that isn't out yet, but your two books, Hagitude and Wise Women. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so I had a strange menopause because I had endometriosis all of my life and was put on the pill, which controlled the only thing that controlled it. And I said to my doctor at 50, I'm coming off the pill no matter what, because of the health effects when you get beyond 50. So I came off the pill at 50, prepared for all kinds of mayhem and pain and chaos. And menopause clearly had been happening in the background. I didn't have another period, but I did have the psychological effects of menopause, and some of the physical effects, the hot flushes. I had a lot of rage. Most of the women that I speak to, I think my main experience of menopause was rage. Everything that I had to suppress as a younger woman or had been told was bad as a younger woman just spewed out at menopause. And yet something in me knew that there was more beyond. And perhaps it's because I had been working with story, and the story, kind of our narrative identity and how it changes over time. So I was kind of tuned into our life stories, and I had been working with the myths that we live by, the myths that kind of define our lives. And at 50, which I was not ready to give up. I was not ready to do what the culture told me I should do and go and sit in a corner and be quiet. That wasn't how I was feeling. And so, as always, when the culture doesn't give us as women a good story to live by, I thought, well, if I can't find in contemporary world or in contemporary women really good role models for menopause and beyond, how about if I go back to myth and especially to folklore? Because you always find that our ancestors had a perspective on these issues that is useful to us. Now, the past was not a golden age. They didn't have everything right, but they knew a lot of stuff that we have forgotten. And so I began, and this would have been about 2019 in the end, I began a research project which is still going on really, to look back at European mythology and folklore and see where the stories of older women are, midlife, menopause, elderhood. Because when you ask people, what do you know about older women in myth and folklore, they talk about the wicked witch or
exactly
the evil stepmother. And it's like, and I thought I knew that there was more than that, because from my Scottish tradition and the Irish tradition, which is part of my heritage, there's a very wonderful old woman called the Cailleach, which literally in Irish and Gaelic means old woman. And she's kind of the creator and shaper of the land. So I knew that there were more than the wicked witches and the evil stepmothers. And I did find that. So it was really that looking for stories that would give me a clue about how it might be possible to move into the second half of life in a way that's purposeful, meaningful, maybe even fun. And when I tied that in with my psychology background, and particularly the work of Carl Jung, who believed that the second half of life was actually a different story, it seemed to make sense that we needed specific stories for this new phase. So that's how I came originally to write Hagitude, which was kind of about the psychology of midlife and elderhood and the kind of archetypal big picture characters in our myth and folklore. And then Wise Women was a collection of all of the stories that I had found up until that point, kind of retellings of the actual stories rather than talking about them.
Yeah, and I've been enjoying both of those books so much. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Even though I've just entered into motherhood, but I'm still loving this exploration of what I have to look forward to.
Well, that was my point, to try to persuade younger women that it is actually something to look forward to. I have loved my life from menopause onwards. It's so much easier in many ways. Clearly challenging in others, but it's great.
Yeah. What are some of the stories? Because in your book you have this wonderful, is it House of Elders you call them, where you outline these various archetypes, and it was very interesting for me also to see which ones I really felt very drawn to. Could you say something about a couple of those, maybe perhaps a couple of the ones that were most important to you?
Yeah, just to say before I do that I had this idea, again, springing from my kind of Jungian psychology and post-Jungian psychology background, that each of us has an inner hag, as I describe it in Hagitude.
Could you say something about the word hag? Because it might not be so familiar to certain people.
Okay, so it actually comes from Old German, the word hag, which is passed into English, and it doesn't have good connotations. But what I love about it is when you go back to folklore particularly, and you look at the women who are described as hags, there's one thing that sets them apart, and that is that they're in the story for themselves. They're not in the story because they're someone's mother or someone's grandmother or someone's wife or daughter. They might be, but that's not who they are in the story. Who they are is whatever remarkable, unique gift they bring to the story. And they're all essential to the story moving forward in some way or other. And I like that because, we spend as women so much of our lives being defined by our relationship to other people and the way that other people perceive us, and those kind of caring, nurturing roles and all of that kind of stuff. And I liked the fact that these older women were really interesting and diverse in different ways. So that's why I used the word hag in Hagitude. And the inner hag then is the kind of the old woman that kind of lies at the heart of us. It's how we recognize ourselves in the older women from these stories. I believe that each of us has at least one of those characters, those archetypal characters, in the diverse range of stories that I uncovered that really we relate to and that we might become. So a couple that were really important to me, the one that I've already mentioned, the Cailleach, the old woman from Scottish and Irish, predominantly Gaelic folklore and mythology, who is the creator and shaper of the land and has been around since the beginning of time. And people talk a lot in mythology about the great mother goddess in Europe. But actually, before there was the great mother goddess, there was the great grandmother goddess, because we see so many of these old, powerful older women throughout European mythology. You have a whole bunch of them in Scandinavian mythology, right? They're not all kind of ugly trolls. Some of them are really quite powerful old women. And some of that crossed over, of course, into Scotland because of cultural exchanges, let's call them.
Yes, that's a euphemism.
for sure. And but the Cailleach is kind of important to me because she is immanent in the land, so she represents the kind of the geology and very much of high, rocky, windy, wet places like the places that I grew up in. But also she is a guardian and protector of the wild things. So she stands up for the wild creatures when, for example, a male hunter wants to shoot a pregnant deer. She won't let him. And she says to him, if you leave my pregnant deer alone, I'll give you a stag, I'll give you a male deer at the right time. So she's always about keeping the world in balance. And it seemed to me that in a world that is so profoundly challenged, environmentally and ecologically, if older women need any kind of a role model, boy, she's it, because she stands strong and firm against the kind of pillaging of the land. And the second one that I would offer up comes from the Slavic tradition, and that is Baba Yaga, who is the old woman. For those of your listeners who might not know her, she is an old woman who lives deep in the woods in a hut which stands on chicken legs, and so it runs around the place, and you might not find it where you last saw it. And she spins through the air in a kind of a vessel for grinding spices. And she is a dangerous old woman. You don't want to meet her in a dark alley at night, you know? And so she is the one who tests the heroes and heroines that come to her for a gift to the point of death. It's serious stuff. You have to be respectful. You have to do the work. You have to be courageous and ready for whatever you might find, weird and wonderful though it might be. And if you pass her tests, you leave carrying the fire. And if you don't, you get roasted in her man-size oven and eaten for her dinner. So this idea of this very powerful old woman who is kind of the gateway. She's an initiator. She initiates them into the next phase of their lives. So I love these two very powerful older women roles. There are many, many more, but those are the two that stand out for me.
Yeah, Baba Yaga has been, I first encountered her in one of the children's stories from my childhood that I remember so vividly, because it was, you could say that the story of Vasilisa and Baba Yaga, would it be fair to say that it's kind of like Cinderella, but in an older Slavic telling?
Yeah, except Baba Yaga clearly has very much older mythic kind of, she was a goddess, no question.
Exactly. It's not Cinderella, but it's Vasilisa has certain similarities. Perhaps Cinderella was inspired. Yeah. And in this book, it has the book that my mother got for me. It had such incredibly exquisite drawings. I can still picture them perfectly. And Vasilisa is one of the women who then has to go into the deep forest to get fire from Baba Yaga. So it's certainly a character that, yes, it made a deep impression on me at the time, I remember. And then going back to the old woman of the land, I was wondering if you want to say something about place as well, because you that's something that you've talked so much about, and how place is our most important teacher. I mean, is that correctly quoting you? I'm not sure, but you've talked about how places teach us so much.
I think so. I think a lot of people forget that. When we look at teachers, we tend to focus on human teachers. And to be honest, I mean, humans have been very important in my life, but place has been my greatest teacher. And the character, let's say, of the various places that I have lived always have had lessons that I seem to have needed to learn at the time. They've just showed me, they've reflected an aspect of what it is to be human, what it is to be a woman human, back at me at key times. And so, yes, one of the things, that's really why I suppose I focus predominantly on European myth and folklore, because I understand the land that they come from. I understand the culture, but also I understand the geology and the nature of the places. And so many of our most powerful old stories come from the land, and particularly if you're talking about women's stories, because throughout Britain and Ireland, and certainly moving into Western and Northern Europe as well, women are portrayed in our mythology as immanent in the land, but more than that, they represent the moral authority of the other world that's entangled with the land. So in our traditions in Britain and Ireland, the other world is not a separate place. that you go to. It's kind of like you might perceive it through a veil, let's say. It's entangled with the land, and women are the ones in our old stories who come out of the other world and say, here's what you've got to do. Or, why don't you come with me, little man, and have an adventure in the other world, you know? And so that sense of women really being very strongly associated with place is absolutely intrinsic to our native mythology. And so, yes, it does seem to me very important to understand the stories of your place if you can find them.
Do you think that, well, it's very clear to me how we need the land, how much it teaches us. And I certainly have the same experience of the places that I have lived, and especially, I mean, I grew up in the mountains in Norway and have since then also lived here in the mountains in Sweden in certain periods. And it has been so important at various points in my life. And even when I'm not here, then I sort of, you have, I guess maybe everybody has a certain type of landscape that is really something that they connect very deeply with. And so for me, I carry that with me even when I'm not there, And so it's very clear to me how I need the land. But what do you think? Does the land need us in some way? Does the land care about us? That what we do there, how we are there?
Yeah. So not very many people ask me that question. So thank you. Yes, I think it does actually. I think I do believe very strongly that we have a moral obligation to find a way to belong to the place where our feet are planted, not just the place we love most or the place we were born, but where we're living right now, however satisfactory or unsatisfactory we find it. We have a moral obligation to be in relationship with it, and that relationship is two-way. And, I spent 4 years on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, the Western Isles of Scotland. And that was a very intense time for me because there weren't very many people. And so, apart from my husband and dogs, and there's only so much you can talk to a husband and dogs, I went out and I talked to the land. And there were lots of stories about the Cailleach there, this old woman who creates and shapes the land. And so I talked to her because, there was nobody else to talk to. To cut a long story short, 4 years after we left, we had to leave for various reasons. The house that we had there took about 2 years to sell while we had already moved to Ireland. And when it sold, my husband went back to clear up a final couple of things from the outbuildings from the farm, the small holding that we were living on. And I said to him to go to a particular place by the seashore where I had really felt the presence of the Cailleach, because there was a kind of silhouette in a cliff face that looked very much like the silhouette of an old woman. And I had talked to that silhouette and, as if it was just a friend or whatever. And around the corner from that silhouette, there was something that I can only describe as a kind of, it was like a bed set into the cliff face. And I slept there a couple of times when summer had got too much for me and the skies were finally darkening in late August, and I wanted to see the stars, which I hadn't seen for 4 months because it's not quite as light as your part of the world in the summer, but almost. And I called it the Cailleach's bed. And that was very funny, because I was the Cailleach sleeping on this big stone bed. And he went back to that place, and it didn't exist anymore. There had been a big stone mattress, as if it was a bed. So you had like the bed base, and then there was this funny stone mattress that was jammed in, and it was Lewisian gneiss, which is a very old and very heavy rock. And the mattress bit had gone. We have photographs showing it kind of before and after. Now, it wasn't right by the sea. It was quite set up from the sea. So, the idea that the sea could come and carry it away was, I guess it's possible, but it seemed unlikely. Now, I'm sorry to all of your listeners if I sound completely bonkers here, but I did have completely mad. I just had this sense that I had spent 2 years grieving for a place that had been formative for me, that I had loved with all my heart, but couldn't stay in for various reasons. And I looked at that, and the Cailleach's bed had gone, and I thought, well, I'm grieving for the land, but what if the land is grieving for me? Now, that sounds very To a lot of people, that sounds completely woo-woo, as we would say here. It sounds as if, what can you be thinking? That you're important enough, that a whole piece of rock would go because you left. But why not? Because nobody else was talking to that land at the time. And I felt as if I had, by talking to it, by kind of falling into its stories, I had woken it up. And then I'd left it.
Mm.
And yeah, so that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I do think that that the land is as much in relationship with us as we are in relationship with the land. Don't we always as humans have this one way concept of the world? I touch my desk, but my desk is actually touching me at the same time. But we don't think of it that way. We think that we're the only ones with agency, and it's nonsense.
That story moved me so much when I read it in the books. I'm so glad that you shared it with us. And I, in a very small way, a less dramatic way, I have also felt sort of a similar experience when I was going through kind of a crisis in my life. My partner and I moved up here to the mountains, and his family has a cabin that's about you have to walk there. It's about a mile from the road, and it's just gorgeous. And I had gone up by myself we were going to spend a year there. We lived there for a year. And I went up a few weeks before my partner because he had various things to do. So I was there for a few weeks by myself. And one of the first mornings I went outside with my breakfast to just sit. It was about the same time of year as it is now. And there was this September sun shining on my face. I was just sitting there. It was perfectly peaceful. And then this wind sort of swept up through the trees, swept up through the grass, and it swept up through me, and it came out as tears in my eyes. Mm. And then it went on, kept going on its way. And I got this very strong feeling that I haven't had before or since, that the place was glad that I was there.
Yeah.
Said, this is where you're supposed to be. This is good. Yeah. We're glad that you're here.
Yeah, why not?
Yes. And I feel almost, every time I think of it, I feel almost, well, yeah, it was an important moment for me because I thought, well, that could be possible. And it's this place that has been so intensely loved by my partner's family for 70 years or something. And I think that love from so many people over all that time, it also, you can feel it in that place.
I think so. And I think you can feel that kind of sense as well in places where people have not forgotten the land. And so I know a lot of people from all parts of the world who go to Ireland and say that they have rarely felt as at home in a place. And they're not talking about people who are very wonderful. They're talking about the land. And I think it's just because the land is used to being interacted with in Ireland. People have never stopped, really. Yeah. The stories are still alive because people still tell them. The archetypal characters are still kind of spoken about or sung about. And I think there is a sense in which if we also can talk to the land or sing to the land or tell a tree a story, we are in some sense keeping it alive. And that's what the moral obligation is to me. We have to do that. It's not just about physically caring for the land anymore than you can just physically care for a person and expect them to thrive. Every human being needs relationship to thrive, and so do most animals. Why would the land be any different? Why would a tree be any different? And and I do that quite a lot. People think I am mad, but I do quite often sing to trees, mostly when people I know are around rather than people I don't know. But you just do have a sense of something looking back at you in some way, something feeling it, hearing it, even if it's just on a vibrational, literally physical vibration level. It's important to do that.
And it's good to hear you talk about this kind of obligation that we have, because when we are in places perhaps like Ireland or perhaps how I experience my partner's place, that it feels easy because the land is already so alive. But even when we're wherever we are, I guess we have to we can be doing that, and perhaps we will. It's something that we get better at, something that we can attune ourselves to over time.
Yeah, and I think it's also a question of finding your place, and the place that calls to you and that gives you, that kind of reflects something back at you. So I've never lived in a desert, but the deserts of New Mexico, particularly in America, have a similar effect on me. It's kind of, I find them intensely transformative, quite different, of course, from my place, which is very wet and very windy. But there is something about that kind of stripped, bare, tricksterish element of the desert that just really shakes me up in a way that isn't always comfortable, but sometimes seems to be necessary.
Yes. I think I have kind of a similar experience of the deserts that I have experienced in the States as well. Well, so then that was place and the Kaliach, and I wanted to perhaps just bring us a little bit back to what you were saying about how coming into the second half of life for you was like, well, I'm not done changing. I'm not done transforming. You know, this is still a journey that I'm on. And I was just thinking about how a lot of people, I think, coming into that part of their life and reflecting on the life that they have lived up to that point can struggle with perhaps feelings of regret, or feeling like, oh, well, it's too late now to do anything. I don't know. How do we work with those kinds of emotions at that point?
That's a big question. So let me try and do it in bits. So I think, first of all, at the most basic level, it's important to understand that for most women, menopause is around the age of 50. And if we are fortunate enough, you know, average life expectancy here in the West is 80, 82, 83 years. So, you know, we have, like, most of us, if we're fortunate, 3 decades is a long time. So, you know, the whole idea that it's too late, it clearly isn't too late. Now, it's dependent on what kind of health we have and all kinds of other things. But women are thriving into their 80s and still doing interesting work. I think for many of us, and it was certainly the case for me, we have a big switch round about midlife and menopause in the stories that we are living. And Jung was interesting on this, Carl Jung. So Jung said that the first half of our life is very outward focused by design. You know, we've got to get a job. We've got to, most of us, you know, enter into marriages or partnerships. We buy a house. We kind of, we build a persona, a kind of attitude to the world, a relationship with the outer world. We have to be in the outer world. That has to be done. It's a little bit heroic, if you like. But in the second half of life, he argued, true for men and for women, but particularly for women, for heaven's sake, because our bodies are going mad at the same time. You know, you can't avoid change at menopause. It's going to happen with or without you going along for the ride. And so in the second half of life, he argued, we turn inwards and we start to ask questions about what this is all for. You know, okay, I've done that. I've been in the world, but really, what is it all for? What am I actually? And the way that I look at this is, as this kind of second story, if you like, is that there are old European ideas, particularly from the classical Greek tradition, but seen throughout Europe and other cultures too, particularly Sufism. This idea that each of us chooses to come into this world in order to be or do something, in order to offer the world a gift. So James Hillman, who I know you're familiar with, an American depth psychologist who's a great influence on my work, called it calling and wrote a very wonderful book, The Soul's Code, about this whole idea that we choose to come here in order to represent something. It's not about grandiosity. It's not about doing something dramatic. It's just about a way of, I think of it as a way of being uniquely human in the world. Just showing up as some unique flower in a particular garden is enough. perhaps for the world. So
do you want to say briefly about his acorn theory as well? Because I think that would be really, it's such a great image and really helpful.
It's a beautiful image. And so Hillman, he used many words in The Soul's Code, this book. He used many words to describe it, but he really mostly centered around this idea of the acorn, which is a potential that we bring with us. And Hillman was very clear, and I think this is true, that it is a potential. And like any seed, if it's given the right conditions, and it's watered and it's allowed, space to grow, then it grows into a beautiful oak tree and it thrives. And Hillman believed that this kind of acorn often was kind of like it was some image or some idea, just some glimmer of something completely undefined, irritatingly, that we bring with us into this world. And that our whole life journey, it seems to me, is working towards uncovering that. And you can't do that in the first half of life. I teach a lot of workshops about this notion of calling. And, there are women in their 20s who are distraught that they haven't figured out what their calling is. And it's like, well, you're not supposed to, because that is the journey of your life. But it seems to me that in the second half of our lives, when we stop, and menopause is a pause, right? When we reach what I think of as a time between stories, the old story of the first half of our lives is just crumbling in front of our eyes. We don't quite know what the new story is, so we're in this pause period. That's the point at which we begin to really, kind of in spite of ourselves, it's an instinctual thing, I think, we begin to really focus in on this gift. And if we do it properly, by which I mean recognize the process and give it time and space, I believe that the second half of our lives is the time when we come into our calling. And I do believe that a lot of the stories and characters that I wrote about in Hagitude and Wise Women give us a little bit of a clue. The ones that we really relate to. When I was a child, even, I related to the wise old woman in the woods. I didn't relate to golden-haired princesses, not where I grew up. There were none. But there were a lot of very powerful old women. And so I always knew that there was something in that image that was for me. Now, clearly as a child, you can't elucidate that. But it's still the image that drives me today, the kind of somewhere between the Cailleach in the high, lonely places and Baba Yaga in the heart of her lonely, dark wood. It's just like that's the essence of something that is me. I don't necessarily yet even quite know always what it is, but that's the image that drives me to do all of the writing and all of the teaching and everything that I do. And I think we each have that. And so what I'm always fascinated about, and what I love to teach about is what are the images, what are the stories that help us find the kind of nature of that particular acorn that we all bring.
And yeah, that was beautifully summarized. I think that I would have been one of those women in their 20s who was freaking out because when I first found this book, The Soul's Code by James Hillman, I was so stressed out by it because I thought that it was saying you need to find your one vocation, the one job that you're supposed to be doing. And I was like, well, what if I'm not doing that? And it stressed me out. And so then later, having read it, I, came to realize, well, what he's really saying is not that there's this one thing that you're supposed to be doing necessarily. And certainly not that you're supposed to be finding it when you're in your mid-20s, but that there is a certain pattern that your soul carries with you and that we can try to express it, but that it can be expressed in a lot of different ways in just the way that we are and all the things that we do.
Yeah, and that goes back to old Greek notions of fate, which everybody thinks of as, the English word would be fatalistic, which means determined. And it wasn't. The whole point about fate was not a specific set of actions that you were obliged to do. It was a pattern, and it was, the fate was all about balance and that sense of your portion. You bring into the world something that is yours. And you have to find it. And if you take something that somebody else's, it kind of doesn't end well. But what I loved, going back to Hillman, what I loved about The Soul's Code And what I've thought an awful lot about since was this idea that he had, that it's like it's not like you just get one shot at this. Okay, so we all walk. Let's think of it as a particular path through life. And his idea was that the world is constantly, the world, the universe, whatever you want to call it, is constantly trying to nudge us towards a path that is aligned with our calling. But we all take side paths. And it's probably just as well, because those side paths, which we think of as failures very often, and that goes back to your question about, when we look back at the first half of our lives, do we think we failed? But those are the ones that teach us everything that we need to know, so that when we actually do get aligned on the path and we meet, for want of a better word, we meet our calling kind of face to face, we have some skills. We've learned a lot of stuff. We've learned what not to do as well as what to do. And that is the essence of every human life. And I am always trying to persuade women, particularly because women tend to beat themselves up, I think, more than men. It's just the nature of the beast. And that if we were to suddenly hit our perfect calling path when we were 20, it's like, what on earth would there be left to do? How would we then go on to learn all of the many things as a kind of human on this earth that we need to learn? And I spent many years beating myself up for what I thought of as, well, not that I thought of them, they were the wrong paths that I took in the first half of my life. But without those skills and without making those mistakes and the humility that it gave me and the ability to laugh at myself happily, then I wouldn't be able to write the way that I do now. It would just have been anodyne. It would have had no color. It would have had no texture. It would have been dull.
Yeah, I think I'm very lucky in the sense that I have a lot of older people around me who are continuing to learn. Their soul is still on its journey, and that inspires me a lot.
Yeah, it has to be. Otherwise, to me, as a psychologist, transformation is the whole point of life. And if there is any point at which you think you've arrived and you've nothing left to learn, then you're already dead in a sense.
And well, speaking of death, that's because that's also something that you write about in Hagitude, is that part of becoming older is also becoming more comfortable with death, and walking side by side with death. And you had your own very visceral experience of that you describe in your book. But do you want to say a little bit about that and this process of becoming more comfortable with having death more close by?
Yeah, I mean, I was someone who had been healthy all my life and was going to live forever, clearly. And then when I was 59, or on the verge of 60, I was diagnosed in the middle of the COVID pandemic and the middle of a series of lockdowns with a very aggressive form of lymphoma. It took a long time to be diagnosed because of the pandemic, and they just caught it in time. And luckily it was a form of lymphoma that, although it's very aggressive, is also very treatable. And so that the end of this story, there is no end to the story, but the story as it sits right now is that I am 5 years in remission, 4 years in remission. And it looks as if that kind of particular episode is over. But it was very visceral, of course, because the chemotherapy that I had, it was one of the most brutal chemotherapies of all. You lose your hair, you lose pretty much everything that kind of defines you, and so you're left with this body that's pretty much a blob and kind of very baby-like, and it just takes you. It's very difficult to put words to it, but it was just you lose sight of your story. It's just like everything is kind of held in the balance, and so what was very clear to me, though, during that process is that whatever happened, whether I was going to die or whether I was going to live for a while longer, it made me very, very much aware of death almost as a kind of archetypal energy. But I see everything archetypally. Of course I do. That's the psychology that I've fallen into. And I really did feel death as a presence. I guess, I'm used to looking at myth and story. It was always going to be so. But I had seen death as an unwelcome visitor. I lost a very a dog that was almost lost a dog that was very dear to me from the same lymphoma, bizarrely, a little while previously. And I had this very strong sense at that time. I described it to a friend as if death walked into my house uninvited and sat down at my table and just wouldn't go away. And I wanted death to go away because I wanted that dog to be with me forever, you know. And this time I realized again, I couldn't just throw death out of the house. It was just a question of, okay, I don't know where we're going. I don't know whether this is a temporary relationship or we're going to be together forever. But I really did have that sense that, okay, you've got to be able to offer death hospitality. And offering somebody hospitality as being in a relationship and maybe being even in a friendship. So I started to really work very hard with this idea of death walking at my side and what was death teaching me. And it was very fascinating because there wasn't a negative part of it. There wasn't a negative thing about it. I saw death as a very beautiful older woman. Not the kind of evil, nasty male skeleton of European folklore and fame. And it just it felt like I had this companion through the valley of the shadow of death. And that was very wonderful. And I knew that even when I was in remission, that I mustn't lose sight of that kind of friendship, that relationship. Maybe death would, hopefully fade a little bit, but was always going to be there. And how do you, I find it very difficult to articulate, so forgive me if I'm not being very coherent with it, but it is without wanting to die, which of course, most of us do not. How do you really accept that as part of life, as just so intrinsically a part of life? And it's a little bit like, I conceived of it a little bit like I described the kind of British and Irish concept of the land and the other world. It's entangled. You can't take the other world out of the land. You can't take the land out of the other world. It's just like it's an entanglement. And that sense of life and death, I don't mean to be as trite as to say you can't have one without the other, but one informs the other, one animates the other. Death animates life. We think of life as the animate thing and death is the kind of like, well, dead thing, obviously, but it isn't. Death animates life in a way. And so it was, and it's still something that I'm working through, it's not just like, again, it's not like a story that ends, but, and not all of it was functional. Not all of it was good. I'd struggled with certain aspects of almost dying, that I'm still working my way through, but it's a whole different dimension, added beautiful mythic dimension to life. And as you get older, I do think I wouldn't recommend that everybody had an aggressive lymphoma, but I would recommend that everybody started to think about that archetypal energy and how it might show up in their lives in a way that's okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Hopefully it's like you're saying we don't want to having to learn from death in that way is not something that we really want to be desiring or asking for, but it is perhaps like a lot of difficult situations. We know that the difficult things perhaps can teach us the most, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily excited about it. And I mean, maybe that is also a little bit connected to what we were talking about in the beginning about these difficult things that we as women go through, where just the physical challenges for many, whether it's regarding menstruation or birth or menopause, that they can be, it's not easy and it's not comfortable, but that doesn't mean that we want it to necessarily go away. It doesn't mean that we would be better off without the hard things. So how do we appreciate without appreciate difficulty without necessarily wanting it consciously, perhaps?
I think to me it is about learning throughout life. And I wonder if as women we don't do this a little bit better because of the particular, embodied, the nature of our embodiment. It's about learning to let go bit by bit. And by letting go, I don't mean not caring or throwing away. I just mean recognizing what is always falling away from us. Literally blood, sometimes, for a lot of our lives. And that and it is a process of, and when you get older, so I'm 64 now, and I've got I hope I've got a very long way to go. Certainly my 74-year-old friends would say that, you haven't even begun to figure this out yet. So in terms of learning, I hope I have got lots more transforming to do if I live long enough. But it's that sense of, as you get older, particularly post-menopause, you find yourself focusing in very intensely on what matters to you. I think almost dying really intensified that for me. It was just like I wasn't going to do anything that I didn't think was important, and that I wasn't going to ever say yes just to please somebody. And that wasn't almost an active choice. It just kind of happened. It happens to a lot of women somewhere in the background. Being nice is no longer your life goal. It's just one of those things where you understand, your body understands. It's not even an intellectual phenomenon. Your body understands that everything is changing, that time is short, that you've just done too much shit in your life that you didn't want to do, and it's time to get over that. And you begin to focus in on what really matters. And a lot of people worry about that and think of it as a negative kind of narrowing. But it's a natural process. It's kind of, it's like it's like the path in front of you is coming, is narrowing and coming to a close as it kind of goes into the dark woods. And that's all right. And it's very beautiful. That sense that everything that's superfluous just begins to fall away. And if you let it go, if you let it fall away, then you're automatically moving towards death without trying very hard or forcing it. Or I don't think I'm explaining this very well, but it's kind of a natural process of getting older. It's just part of the process. And once you begin to figure that out, the naturalness of that is very, very comforting.
Mm. Yes. And is there anything else you would say to that regarding, for women who are perhaps, especially women who are in the throes of menopause and finding it very difficult, what were some key things that you were, that helped you when it felt extra difficult?
Well, what helped me, and I wrote about this in Hagitude, was really seeing that process as an alchemical process. Carl Jung wrote a lot about alchemy, but he wrote about it in a very kind of not particular, very psychologized sense. It wasn't particularly physical. He was a man, apart from anything else. But I did see that, particularly in menopause, for women, that what's happening to our body is a process of everything that you thought wants to find you fading away. And in alchemy, we have this very beautiful, albeit brutal, stage, which is called the nigredo, the blackening. And it is the process where the substance that you're starting, the substance that you're starting with, the substance that is being alchemized, is kind of burnt away. It's burnt back to its essence. And there are various stages within that, but we won't go into them. But it's about, you burn away all of this stuff that isn't really important, and you're left with some essence of a thing at the core. And then the rest of alchemy is about how you kind of build that up and use it and so on. But that stripping away is the essence of menopause. But the beauty is what you find in the middle. It's that core. And that is, takes us back to the kind of acorn theory that we've been talking about and so on. So when everything that wants to find you is gone, what's left? What's you? What is really you that's left? And then how do you take that core, that essence, with you into the story, that new story of the second half of your life? And it is a very beautiful process. And I think that if I would say one thing to anybody, still in the throes of all of that chaos of perimenopause, kind of midlife, all the way through to the actual point of menopause, it's just hold on to that image. Find an image that you can hold on to, that you think, okay, this is really crap, but it's going to be great, because in the end, because I've got this thing that I'm going to be aware of, that I will have revealed about myself. And it's very exciting. I really genuinely and having gone through it, I still find it exciting.
That's wonderful. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, it seems like we as a society perhaps have begun to try to reclaim a little bit of the, shall we call it, spirituality that we have lost. Or you write about enchantment, that we are partly trying to re-enchant the world in some way. We're trying to rekindle our relationship to land, to the other world, to the imaginal realm, as you speak of it. And, as an example in your book, you talk about witches and how, witches was seen, have for a long time had a very negative connotation, and that now that's shifting. A lot of people are self-proclaimed witches, and, for various reasons, we see, certain things shifting. And so I'm wondering, in part that seems like it's a good process. We're trying to open up things that have been perhaps ignored and forgotten for too long. And then I also wonder about, what do we need to be wary of in that process? What is it that we need to, is there anything that we should be thinking about as we try to perhaps reawaken parts of ourselves and parts of our societies or communities that have been ignored and neglected? Does that make sense as a question?
I think so, yeah. I mean, a lot of it to me is discernment, that there is. So we're looking at a way of perceiving the world or understanding the world that goes beyond the purely intellectual and the rational. So it's more what we might think of as the feminine qualities, kind of intuitive, creative, relational. But we also, but neither of those ways of approaching the world is healthy by itself. And so to me, it's very much about, okay, we need to awaken this sense of the importance of the image and the imagination and the story and the underlying archetypal energies, let's call them, in the land around us. But we also have to bring a bit of sense to it and really kind of question ourselves and what we're seeing and what we're doing and why. And so it's very much about a balance for me. That process of enchantment is still requires some kind of rational approach, so that we are still grounded. And also that grounding, I think, comes from the body. And it's important, as we're working with the mythic, with the imaginal, with the enchanted, to really just focus in on our body and what our body is telling us, because the body is all shot through with the imaginal and the other world, just like the world that we think of as outside us is. And I think we can sense it, but in order to sense it, in order to kind of to have a sense of what is true and what is what is made up as opposed to kind of imaginal, we need to really be able to be grounded and tuned into our body and what it's feeling and what it's telling us. So it's a complicated process, that process of enchantment. It's not just a question of swapping one way of looking at the world for another. We can't undo and shouldn't undo a lot of the teachings of the Enlightenment, damaging as they have been, because they've gone to the extreme. We bring them with us, and we marry them with the stuff that we have lost, and with stories that we still have to create and to imagine. And we say, okay, how can we move forward in a more balanced way? And I think it is happening. It's not always happening in a comfortable way around the world, but I think there is a very strong sense in a number of audiences, young people as well as older people, that sense of the sacred, if I can put it that way, that we have lost has damaged us. What you don't want to do is just go, shooting off in all directions, looking for anything that might seem to fill that gap. I think it does require that discernment. It does require that groundedness, and a kind of gentle foray into all of the things that we've turned away from in the past. It's only in the past couple of 100 years, most of human history there. We've been thoroughly enchanted, so it is still there. We have the muscle memory.
Well, because one of the things that I really admire about you and your work is that it seems to me at least, that you're very intellectually rigorous, and you seem to really enjoy that. And then at the same time, you obviously have this deep intuition, for lack of a better word, even though that's even understanding what that really means is a whole another episode in itself. But do you find that you struggle with striking that balance, or do you feel that it's something that has sort of naturally evolved for you, working with just those different capacities, those different faculties?
It did naturally evolve, but it was a struggle in the sense that, I was a very, very imaginative child who was lost and steeped in myth and story, and then had it kind of beaten out of me, particularly in my psychology degree, my initial psychology degree, which was a very behavioral psychology degree. We were not allowed even to say the word mind because you couldn't see a mind. And so how did you know it was there? You could say brain, because you could cut it open and, mind. No, that was just so. It was really mad. And it took me a long time to find my way back out of that the scientistic, we would say in English even, rationalistic, insanely confined world, to be able to go back and marry all of the imaginal stuff but still keeping the good part of what I had learned, which is, yes, as you say, rigor. It's like, let's just not believe just anything that we hear. And if we think that we have seen something or perceived something, let's interrogate it. Why not? Again, the one way of knowing doesn't have to exclude another. And I think what we're particularly bad at as humans is marrying these different ways of knowing in a way that's kind of healthy. It's a struggle that each of us goes through, and each of us brings our own stuff to it. But I think it's a really important struggle to have. And it's just, again, it comes down to discernment.
Do you want to say anything about the things that are coming up next for you, what you're working on now?
Well, actually, I'm going back to having spent 2 books worth looking at elderhood in women. I'm actually stepping back a little bit and kind of looking at the first half of life, actually all of life, but looking at fairy tales and the kind of fairy tale heroine and what happens when she walks out of the door. And it's a book it's called Ripening, but the subtitle is Why Women Need Fairy Tales Now, and it is premised on the idea that every fairy tale begins in a catastrophic time. It begins with war, it begins with being thrown out of the home. Literally every fairy tale heroine walks out of the door, she has nothing. She has none of the trappings of her former life, she has nothing. How does she get, in these difficult, challenging times, how does she get to a stage where she's not only survived, but she might actually have thrived? And so I'm looking back at all of the values and the behaviors that fairy tales encourage us to adopt. And, a lot of it is about building community and relationships. No fairy tale heroine gets to the end of her journey alone if she wants to succeed. The ones that try to do it alone are the ones that fall by the wayside. They're the other 2 sisters of the 3. And so it's all about building community. It's about kinship with other than humans, because that community is not just a human community. It's the birds and the mice that help you sort the seeds. It's the tree that where the bones of your mother are buried that, shows you how to get through. So it's some of these, they sound like very traditional values, and they are, but they don't have to be necessarily kind of, conservative values with a big C. But it's very much about how, in the kind of times that we face today, it's really not unique. Every challenging time seems unique. And on the face of it, it might appear to be different. But the nature of the challenges that we face are the nature of the challenges that women have always faced in challenging times. And these stories that have been passed down through the generations by our ancestors give us a lot of clues as to how we might actually find our way through. So that's what Ripening is about. And I'm kind of looking forward to it. Very much builds on the work that I've already done, but it does seem particularly topical given the nature of the world that we're living in at the moment. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that coming out, which will be next May 2026, and having the conversations around it.
Well, I'm so excited about reading that. Thank you for writing that for us at this time.
Thank you.
Sharon's latest book, Ripening, Why Women Need Fairy Tales Now is now available. You'll find links to that and the things we talked about in the show notes. This was the final episode of the Blood Mysteries miniseries, exploring the interweaving of the biological, emotional, and spiritual in the context of women's bodies. You'll find previous episodes via links in the description, on the website, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I really want to stay in touch with you outside of Meta's grip, so please make sure to follow the show in your podcast app, or even better, sign up for the free newsletter at forestofthought.substack.com, and you'll receive new episodes, essays, and events straight to your inbox. You can also provide deeply appreciated support for the show via Patreon or Substack. All the info is in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.